Welcome to Badass Short Stories from Byzantium, where I will take a deeper dive into the topics otherwise briefly mentioned in the episodes proper. I am your host, Keith Hernandez, and today we will be talking about Manuel II and his European tour. Up top, this is something new I wanted to try out. These episodes will be more bite-sized and will be released between the main ones. If you like or dislike this format, please let me know. My social media handles are all under Badass Byzantium, and my email is badassstoriesfrombyzantium@gmail.com. Also, if you would consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month on my Patreon at patreon.com/badassbyzantium, it would go a long way in getting these truly amazing stories out there. Okay, enough introduction. Let's begin. For today's episode, I want to take a bit of a deeper dive into Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, who, if you recall, in 1399 left Constantinople to his estranged nephew and went on an unprecedented tour of Europe to request military aid against the Ottomans. This event was significant not only because it exemplifies the desperate situation the Byzantines had found themselves in the late 14th century, but also because medieval rulers simply did not do this, especially not medieval rulers with deep religious and ethnic divides, as was the case with Eastern Roman emperors and Western European kings. To have diplomatic relations with another ruler meant sending embassies and at best personally writing that person. But a face-to-face meeting meant that whatever business was to be discussed was of the utmost importance. Manuel II's tour is also fascinating because we have many Western points of view of the event and vice versa. There are first-hand accounts of the athletic, bald, and bearded middle-aged emperor and his party of Romans, who, although the West was surpassing, were still a mystery. If you recall from episode 5, in the late 14th century, Manuel II won out in the dynastic duel against his brother Andronicus IV, who had rebelled against their father and in doing so lost place in the succession and an eye. Andronicus' 3-year-old son, John VII, fared the same fate, but would prove to be a thorn in Manuel's side as he came into his own. By this time, a policy of appeasement to the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire had long been established by Manuel's father, John V, who himself had made his own European excursion, though it was much more limited in scope. In Rome, on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, John V publicly renounced orthodoxy in an attempt to acquire aid against the Ottomans. Similar gestures had been made before, and even in person, as Michael VIII had done, but this time was different. To quote the late Byzantine historian Peter Charanus, in Manuel II Palaiologos, a study in late Byzantine statesmanship, quote, "The stakes were no longer goals of power or restoration of former glory, but bare survival." I'll be using this book as the main source for this topic, by the way. Sadly, John V solicited nothing of significance, save for the exception of his cousin Amadeus of Savoy, who launched a successful crusade in Gallipolis. Humiliated and willing to suffer further humiliation for the safety of his Roman subjects, John V entered the Byzantine Empire into vassalage under the Ottomans in 1371, and so began an official policy of appeasement. This status was begrudgingly upheld by Manuel, who preferred Western intervention as a mode of survival. This is not super important for the story, but it's interesting to note that Demetrius Kydones, whose hyperbolic description of the Turkification of Anatolia I read in episode 5, likely encouraged both Manuel and John V to adopt such a policy. Shocker, I know. Now, knowing how disastrous Roman foreign relations had been since Michael VIII, it's not unreasonable to think this new state of vassalage was unsustainable. However, the Roman people looked out with Manuel II because he was just the man for the job. He was striking, intelligent, and showed great mental fortitude, bearing the weight of his suffering people while still proving resourceful. But above all, he was a master of diplomacy. He was largely unmatched in this arena among the Palaiologans, save for Michael VIII. Further, it was the opinion of Charanus that Manuel II would have ushered in a golden age under normal circumstances, which, unfortunately for Manuel, these were anything but. It is in this context that we get into the meat and potatoes of today's episode. The year was 1394, and Manuel, the pragmatic diplomat that he was, knew he needed to take steps towards a unified dynasty. This meant he would have to set aside his differences with his nephew, John VII, who himself felt had been cheated out of the succession, and begin talks of reconciliation. Such conversations indeed began, and eventually reached the ear of Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, who, like his father Murad I, aimed to keep the Byzantine court divided. When the negotiations turned to the succession, the Sultan caught word of this as well, possibly from the lips of John VII himself, in an attempt to use it as a bargaining chip. It would appear not everyone was quite ready for reconciliation. Angered by Manuel's action, and quick to anger he was, Bayezid called forth all of his Orthodox vassals in the Balkans, Manuel included, where he mutilated some of the Byzantine noblemen in Manuel's party, then sent him on his way. As if this punishment weren't enough, the Sultan further demanded the creation of an Ottoman quarter within Constantinople. It was at this point that appeasement became untenable. By spring, Manuel cut ties with the Sultan, and Constantinople was put under siege shortly thereafter. This was not as foolish as it would seem on the surface, however, as he was already in talks with Central and Western European leaders. See, Manuel had already faced much humiliation from Bayezid, from his giving up of Thessalonica years earlier to the siege of the capital, so he had much motivation to seek aid against the Ottomans rather than rely on appeasement for survival. Not long after the siege began, he helped broker a deal with Western leaders to unite in a major crusade, though because of the blockade at Constantinople, he himself could not provide any actual military support. The crusading army nonetheless supposedly grew to 100,000 people, and made up of Hungarian, French, Wallachian, German, and English forces, with volunteers from across Europe. It crossed the Danube and laid siege to Nicopolis in September 1396. But their size worked against them, and they were disorganized. This led to their downfall, as the better organized Ottoman army massacred the Crusaders. Though utterly destroyed, Crusade leader Sigismund of Hungary had escaped to Constantinople. Amazingly enough, he told Manuel he planned to organize another force and try again the following spring. This, as you can imagine, would not happen, as his prestige and manpower had plummeted after the massacre. With his troops now freed up, Bayezid prepared an assault against the city, and called on Manuel to surrender and have John VII installed. The assaults proved unsuccessful, however, as the Roman and Latin inhabitants of Constantinople and Pera, situated across the Golden Horn, fought side by side to keep the Ottomans out. Venetian and Genoese galleys were also trickling in to help with the city's defense. By spring 1397, the siege relaxed, possibly due to the failures of Bayezid's assaults. Despite the crusading army's crushing defeat at Nicopolis, Manuel still believed in Western intervention. He had been writing other leaders since, at the advice of the Venetians, who were unwilling to provide any further military support, but were happy to facilitate talks. Church reunification was dangled before Western leaders as a reward for military aid, and was worded in such a way that made it seem as though the Byzantines were willing, but literally couldn't send their church officials because of the Ottoman blockade. Send an army and they're all yours. In 1397, a letter to France prompted a positive response from French King Charles VI, who sent the Roman embassy away with 12,000 gold francs and a promise to commit troops the following year. In April 1398, encouraged by Manuel's outreach and the prospect of church unification, the Pope sent a bull to Western leaders demanding military or financial support for another crusade against the Ottomans, and would do so again in 1399, following direct negotiations with Manuel's son-in-law, this time promising indulgences for the remission of sins. We've heard that one before. Western European financial support was meager, but the French king followed through and sent a force of 1,200 men. This force grew on its way to Constantinople and was welcomed with open arms when it finally reached the city. I know that story I just told complicates things a bit. I have said many times the West provided nothing of substance when asked for military aid, but the reality is a little more nuanced. That said, the relief force helped some, but much more help was needed. It was clear at this point that Manuel had to ask for more help in person. This reminds me of my reporting days. When it was obvious I was getting the runaround from a source, or they were dodging my calls, I knew what I had to do. I had to show up in person and apply that personal touch. Hello, Chief So-and-so. I just thought since I was in the area I'd get a comment from you about such and such. More often than not, this actually worked. It's hard to be rude or ignore someone right in front of you, especially if it's someone like Manuel, with his imposing kingly figure. My figure is anything but you get the picture. He also had another factor working for him, which was the sense of mystery that still surrounded the Byzantine world in Western eyes. Charanus wonderfully sums this up. He writes, quote, "In spite of the long process of decline through which Byzantium had been passing, while the Latin West had been surging ahead on its own, the glory of the successors of Constantine had not been forgotten. Indeed, Byzantium to the west had always appeared as a realm of almost fairy tale splendor and grandeur, a reputation that the ordeal of the Crusades, tragic decay, and degradation before the Turkish advance had not entirely dimmed." Manuel knew what he needed to do, but he needed someone to watch the city before he could leave. Someone he knew would not give it up. Amazingly, it would be the very nephew that supposedly started this mess. John VII was tiring of being the face for Bayezid's coup. He even sent a letter to the French king asking for a castle of his own. But of course, this was denied. It was in this context that John and Manuel, who clearly had need of each other's cooperation, reconciled. In exchange for watching the city while Manuel was gone, John would get Thessalonica as an appanage. Manuel left December 10th, 1399, a week after John entered the city. Now, it's unclear how much he trusted his nephew. I know I wouldn't, but he did move his family to the Morea while he was gone, just in case. Manuel kicked off his tour in Venice, then across Italy. Everywhere, he was treated as an honored guest and showered with gifts. The Florentines agreed to provide support as long as the other European leaders did, a promise that would soon become a reoccurring theme. It's unknown if he met with the Pope at this time, but in May, the Pope renewed his calls for a crusade. Manuel was paraded into Paris in June 1400 and lodged at the Old Louvre. Charles VI, like the Western leaders before him, agreed another crusade was in order, and even provided an additional 1,200 men. Manuel went on royal hunts and took part in feasts and celebrations. This was a great time of optimism for the Byzantine Emperor, an outlook that can be seen in a letter he wrote to a friend during his stay. He wrote, "Many indeed are the favors that have come to me from the most illustrious king, and many from those in authority, all of which surely bears witness to their nobility of soul and love for us, and an extensive kind of zeal for the faith." He continues, "There is a great hope of my returning speedily to our homeland, for which, as I know, you on your part are praying, and against which on their side our enemies are praying." Everyone in Europe seemed to love the energetic bearded man, and made promises for military support, just as long as everyone else put up when the time came. Manuel was sure to cover all of his bases while in Western Europe. He even sent out embassies to nearby kingdoms he did not plan to visit himself. The King of Aragon, one such kingdom, agreed that a crusade was needed, and wrote to neighboring Castile, urging its king to help as well. The embassy would travel throughout Spain, enticing its hosts with religious relics. And then, in the summer of 1400, Manuel's eyes turned to England. An intermediary explained the awkwardness such a visit may invoke, as the English and French were not friends, so to speak. But what appealed to Henry IV anyway? They left for the island in winter 1400. It was a good time to leave France, as Charles VI, who was known to slip into long bouts of insanity, was indisposed at this time. Manuel was greeted in much the same way in England as he was in France. He greatly admired Henry IV, as was evident in a letter he wrote to a friend during his stay in London. He wrote of the English king, "This man is at once most illustrious in form and most illustrious in judgment. At once, with his might he astonishes all, and with his sagacity he wins himself friends, and he extends a hand to all, and himself furnishes every sort of assistance to those who are in need of aid." Manuel continues, "And he appears very pleasant in his conversations, gladdening us in all ways, and honoring as much as possible, and loving us no less. And while he has gone in excess in all his negotiations, he seems even to blush a little, supposing himself, alone of all, to fall short of what is needed. So magnanimous is this man." It's amazing to read and hear these words from one great leader to another, and to see these people so humanized and humbled. But despite all of his optimism and sincerity, as well as the sincerity of his hosts, he was starting to notice the excuses. For example, though King Henry IV expressed interest in another crusade, he was not able to commit much military aid as he was facing revolts by the Scots and Welsh. He did send the emperor away with heavy pockets, however. Despite striking out in England, Manuel II returned to France 2 months later, in 1401, with renewed vigor. While there, he attended a Latin liturgy with Charles VI, which shocked many who did not like that their king was associating with the Orthodox leader, and inspired admiration in others for his display of tolerance. Over the next year, Manuel would appeal to the Timurids, and even to the anti-pope, Benedict VIII, who promised his support and the support of the states that recognized him. In another letter around this time, it is clear Manuel still believed an army would come out of all of this, though he was starting to admit some feelings of uncertainty. He was aware some of the promises made would be too good to be true, but did not think he would go home empty-handed, which makes what is about to happen all the more tragic. When Manuel finally called in his favors, Everyone seemed to have an excuse for not being able to participate. Everyone was either held up with domestic issues or waiting for everyone else to start fulfilling their own commitments to the crusade. A pessimist like myself would conclude no one was actually prepared to commit. Not the Florentines, not the Kingdom of Spain, not the Kingdom of England, and perhaps even more devastating, not even the Kingdom of France, which was the ideal candidate to lead the crusade. But the madness of Charles VI intervened, and so too did the infighting of his family. What's more, Venice, which had helped fund much of the emperor's trip, refused to provide any more assistance until France or Genoa coughed up some money as well. Running out of options and perhaps not wanting to return home empty-handed, Manuel stayed at the French court, becoming a sort of fixture there and even penning literary works. That is until 1402, when news reached him from the east that Tamerlane had captured Bayezid and the siege of Constantinople had been lifted. So much for all of that. Manuel would never give up on the notion that the West could save Byzantium. Even after it emerged autonomous at the turn of the 15th century, he would play Bayezid's sons off each other in an attempt to stall time so that another crusade could materialize. If you listen to episode 5, you'll know by now that another crusade would not materialize until the 1440s, and that one too would end in failure. Still, he never gave up on the notion that the Ottomans, not the Latins, were the true enemy of the Byzantines. Thank you all for listening to that more in-depth story about Manuel II. I was really excited to tell it, and I look forward to doing more of these smaller episodes in the future. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, truth is the soul of history.